Andrew Ridker is here with me today. Well, he and I are both here today on, I guess this is the Cosmic Cheeto Podstack number 9, which I know I always, I always like affect some kind of cluelessness about what number it is at the beginning of every one of these. But this time it's not an affectation. I'm really not quite sure. But you're here for number 9, Andrew. It's such a pleasure, amazing pleasure to have you. Um, we're going to talk about well, I love both of your books that are out right now. I We're going to talk about this one, which is the latest. It is fantastic. Um, it is a multi-generational story of a Jewish family in Brookline, Massachusetts. Much to say, very pumped to get into it. But and of course, like I could give the cliff notes of your bio, right? Like when was
Sure.
Altruists? Was it
Um, that was 2019, maybe?
2019? Okay, yeah. Well, you had I have gifted it, so I'm sorry, but you probably have an Altruists. Can you show us the Altruists?
Um,
The shelf of Ridker.
yeah, up there. The white one up
There,
there.
yeah, okay, it's the white one up there. And there'll be many a link in this podcast, but that book with the white cover, another kind of fantastic example of this. Actually, we were having a phone call about this earlier this week. This kind of blend of big-hearted, cynical, domestic, multi-generational Jewish, sort of family fiction. Not to pigeonhole you too much, but The Altruist is a fantastic, kind of like first essay into that territory, and then Hope just like crushes the game. And so and you, of course, like you've had you've had like quite like a lot of other, I think like critical publications and success. I'm a huge fan of your book reviews. I think that I want to recommend the Surveillance, the
Mm.
way back when, right? You had that like surveillance fiction book, which I've
It
read
was
some good. Yeah.
yeah, I was in college. It was the summer actually before senior year of college. I was working at the Boston Review
Yeah.
and it was like the Edward Snowden, Google Glass,
Yeah.
NSA summer. And I started soliciting
The
these
Merlot.
poets about
Yeah.
like, do you have any work on surveillance for the magazine? And
Hmm.
I probably asked like 20, thinking I'd get maybe three.
Hmm.
And everybody was like, that's so crazy. I'm actually working on something like that right now. We had way too much
Yeah.
for the magazine. And I sort of got the permission from the editors to move it out of the magazine and partnered with a small press in Boston and basically ended up with this poetry anthology where it's themed around surveillance. It's called Privacy Policy.
Yeah.
But in a way, it also kind of doubles as this like anthology of contemporary poetry from a very specific snapshot in time. Everyone's writing about surveillance, but from so many different angles that, yeah, when I think about it now, I think about that political dimension, but I also think about like, oh, this is like a little bit of this kind of who's who of what's going on in contemporary poetry circa like 2014, pretty much.
That's so wow. That oh my gosh, I was mistaken. For some reason I was thinking that those were like your some like critical writings you had paired
Mm,
with, but that's actually you edited a poetry anthology. That's awesome. I will obviously link to that as well. Super cool. So yes, history and publishing, which we will get into. But
sure.
without further ado, we're going to jump into your 5 minute selection from Hope, which I am very excited to hear, having not gotten to hear you read from the book.
Great. Yeah, I will just read the first few pages here.
Yep.
This opens in, let's see, in August of 2013, and the section is titled The Hunger Banquet. Everyone will take a card, said Deborah Greenspan, cradling a wicker basket in her arms. The cards are divided into three tiers of income. Your tier will determine where you sit, with whom, and most importantly, how much food you'll eat tonight. She was small and stringy, all sinew and knob, standing with her shoulders squared and spine erect before a wall papered with William Morris pomegranates. I should add that the cards come with names and nationalities. We'll spend the night in character, almost like a game. It's educational, of course, but let's not forget that it's also supposed to be fun. Excuse me, Carla Cantor said. I thought this was a potluck. Carla sat beside her husband Sidney on a silver damask sofa Deb had recently purchased to replace the love seat that for years had occupied its place. In addition to the Cantors that evening, there were three other couples, the Seltzers, Saxes, and Steins, clustered like a class of school children eagerly awaiting instructions from their teacher. Deb's mother-in-law, Marjorie, sat in one of two mahogany bergères, also new, her head bobbing as she slipped in and out of consciousness. Not quite, Carla, but I appreciate the babka. No, the purpose of this evening is to replicate, in a controlled environment, the lottery of birth and its consequences. Carla blinked. The lottery of birth. And its consequences. It's important that you pick your card at random, no peeking, to make sure that we emphasize the element of chance. I'm sorry, said Carla. I'm not sure I understand. Deb flashed a diplomatic smile. Then I guess you'll just have to wait and see. The Greenspans lived in an eccentric Queen Anne at the northern end of Crown and Shield Road, where the quaint suburban quiet of Brookline, Massachusetts gives way to the tremble and clamor of Commonwealth Avenue. It was here that Deb dreamed up her neighborhood initiatives, here that she held house parties for Democratic hopefuls, here that she hosted Passover Seders where she served her celebrated brisket, the secret, a dusting of Lipton powdered onion soup, and homemade gefilte fish on plates her grandparents had smuggled out of Poland. With its canary yellow siding, white window trim, and red pagoda roof above the door, the house, like its inhabitants, stood out among its gray stucco neighbors. Unlike the other couples in her social circle, Deb hadn't moved to Brookline for the schools. She was born in this sylvan streetcar suburb, and more than anyone embodied the spirit of civic engagement that made it such a special place to live. When she wasn't raising money for the high school's innovation fund, she chaired her synagogue's resettlement committee, procuring housing and furniture and steady work for immigrants. She baked flourless cookies for the crossing guard with celiac and invited Holocaust survivors to speak to local students. She remained a reliable chaperone for field trips long after her own kids had left for college, guiding sixth graders through the dead mills of Lowell, passing out condoms and bottles of water at the LGBT youth dance held each year at City Hall. Where Deb found the time to perform these good works while bringing up two apparently well-adjusted children was a mystery. She had raised them on salmon and positive discipline, T-Berry Brazelton and after-school enrichment, prearranged playdates and Bill Nye the Science Guy, birthdays at the Boston Children's Museum, and plaster fun time. She had read them Maurice Sendak to fall asleep and played Caribbean folktales on cassette. She'd bought Legos and Connects and Mavis Beacon teaches typing, tickets to the MFA and Puppet Show Place Theater. She'd signed them up for swimming lessons at the JCC and classes at the Russian math school in the afternoons. There were some, like Carla Cantor, who believed that Deb had invested too much time in her children, that there was something almost pathological about her level of involvement. But if Deb's critics disapproved of her methods, they couldn't argue with the results. Her daughter Maya worked at an August New York publishing house whose colophon, a fruit tree representing knowledge, was stamped on the spines of all the best books in the house. Her son Gideon was pre-med at Columbia, preparing to follow in the footsteps of her husband, Scott. And I'll cut it off there because we'll just kind of set it up and leave it.
Phenomenal. It sets up my first question perfectly. So much that I can actually segue by saying, speaking of salmon and positive discipline, this book is like set over a decade ago, right? And
Mhm.
I just think that like the fact that like we're talking about a family during the Obama era, and we're talking about, this kind of like diehard commitment to liberal goodness, and not just to like, the abstract concept of, like goodness, but I would say
Mhm.
like the individual commitment to the good.
Yeah.
And how, I mean, this is the era, right, when I was watching The Inconvenient Truth, and Al
Mm,
Gore told me, the child of boomer liberals, that I needed to turn off the goddamn lights,
right.
and I needed to reduce my carbon footprint, or else the world would end and it would be my fault. And I was a good little consumer, and I did as Al Gore told me. I think as many of the Brookline crowd you're describing did as well. And so, Andrew, like, especially when we're talking about a family like the Greenspans, right? And Deb as its kind of moral compass, at least in
Mhm.
the passage you're reading. I'm really curious about, like, without giving away too much, either of the book or what we're going to talk about, I'm curious about what this individual commitment to the good, sort of like, what it unleashes in people and how it actually kind of like might result in behavior that's quite bad or like
Yeah,
ethically questionable.
it's a really interesting question because I think the sort of, I mean, we screened An Inconvenient Truth in my high school. The hunger banquet concept that opens the book, this kind of like themed dinner party in which everybody play acts as someone from a high, middle, or low income country and gets served an amount of food accordingly, was also something we did at my high school. I wish I could have taken credit for making it up, but it was actually, I think it's an Oxfam like activity. And I think the only real satirical difference between the book and real life is that in real life it's usually done for high school students, and in the book you have this kind of group of adults very seriously uh, doing that exercise. But those types of tropes, like a hunger banquet, the inconvenient truth, like these, that's 1000% the way I grew up. And I think to your point about in what ways can that lead to bad behavior, you know, when you grow up believing that you live in a meritocracy and individual choice kind of determines the fate of the country or the world, um, it results in an insane amount of pressure where you feel like I'm turning off the lights, I'm recycling, and climate change is still happening.
Right.
And part of you in your mind is like, it's my fault because I was told I could do it and I'm doing some stuff, but clearly this is out of my hands. But it's very hard to give up. It's very hard to accept that it's out of your hands because
Yeah.
when you're raised to believe that it's in your hands, there's also something flattering in that. It's kind of a bummer to realize you might not be able to do much about climate change as an individual. And it's an easy road to cynicism and nihilism from there. So I think when people with a strong individual commitment to the good misbehave, as many of my characters do, it's coming out of this pressure cooker feeling of I'm trying to do everything right and it's not working. Uh, it reminds me, there's this great anecdote in this book. There's this book by an academic named Lily Geismer, who wrote the book's called Don't Blame Us, and it's about suburban Massachusetts and the sort of liberal thinking that grew there and the reasons why it grew there. And it has to do with the highways and the money that was coming in from STEM stuff with government and the Cold War. And there's all this interesting stuff, but she tells this anecdote, which the book gets its title from, where in 1972, Nixon won re-election very easily, and he won every state except one, and that state was Massachusetts, where I'm from and where the book is set.
Mm.
And after that election, you would see cars driving along Route 128, which is like the sort of golden lasso that encircles these nice suburbs outside of Boston.
Mhm.
And the bumper sticker on the cars would say, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts." And
Mm.
it's this kind of slogan that encapsulates so much about that worldview, which is a kind of exceptionalism. I mean, it's an exceptionalism that goes back to the Puritan notion of Boston as like a city on a hill. And so if your exceptionalism can breed some contempt for others, right? Like, don't blame me, I didn't vote for him. At the same time, it sets a really high bar for those who see themselves as exceptional. So in a meritocracy, your successes are your own, but so are your failures. And when you think you live in a meritocracy, but you don't, it gets really hard to deal with those failures, and bad behavior can ensue.
Oh, absolutely. I'm thinking too, right, of like the fact that the Greenspans, as a Jewish family living in this kind of, well-heeled suburban enclave, like of course they're subject to this feeling of exceptionalism, but like as Jews, and I think this is kind of important to remember where you're invoking the dishes kind of smuggled over from Poland and stuff. They're also accepted, right? And so,
Mm.
you have that kind of, yeah, that puritanical exceptionalism, the city on the hill, where this beacon of like, goodness and insight, right? And sort of like intellectual fortitude. And at the same time, you also have Jews who are historically a community that has been accepted, right? Who has been, if we're looking back into, the time of the old country or Eastern European Jews, Ashkenazis, of course, you have the pogroms and the Jewish ghettos. And so it's really like this is like what really like grabbed me by the lapels about your book, right, is you have a family, and many families, of course, but like in the Greenspans are kind of constantly weighing their responsibility, to the greater good, to the larger world, and their individual responsibilities, to themselves or their sort of their smaller circles. And so, yeah, the meritocratic, the concept of the meritocracy as hinging entirely on the action or like of a single individual, it's like insane amounts of pressure. And I think yeah, it's illustrated very beautifully, I think, in my one of my favorite parts of the book. My son, the doctor, is drowning, Scott Greenspan. To that end, I'm really curious about like how, you said you grew up in in these suburbs, right, in this area. I'm so curious how your personal experience of this like type of liberalism, this meritocratic liberalism, influenced your writing of Hope, even your decision to write it.
Yeah, I mean, all the stuff we've even talked about so far, like like the Al Gore stuff, the Hunger Banquet stuff, the like don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts. I mean, that was my childhood. Like
Hmm.
uh Brookline, Massachusetts is like at least 30% Jewish, probably 90% liberal or progressive. It really is a bubble in the sort of classic sense of things. It's affluent, but it's not affluent in the way that it's not in like a McMansion-y, kind of maybe more conservative coded it's like affluent, but with a strong sense of social responsibility.
Hmm.
And to that end, it's like I went to a public school, but it was a public school in such a nice town that the taxes on the nice houses in the suburb are what's funding the school and making it so good. But at the same time, the people there will be like, we send our kids to public school. Like, we don't send our kids to private school because we believe in public school.
Hmm.
So at every stage of my life, there were these contradictions. Like, private school, charter schools bad, public schools good, but public schools good because neighborhood good and expensive, right? Like, and to your point, the point you made about, Jewish families and Jewish history, similarly, it's like hundreds of thousands of years of persecution, amazing window we're inhabiting of acceptance and affluence. Trying to resolve those two things felt, contradictory as well. So I think when you grow up in a place where you have a lot and you live in a time and place of plenty, but you also have this immense social responsibility, you're just like crippled by guilt and that feeling of responsibility again. I know so many people from my high school who went off to do very noble things with their lives, to work in service of some kind or do some sort of charitable works, sort of to the dismay of their doctor, lawyer parents.
Hmm.
Because they're like, well, yes, we raised you with these good values, but we also wanted you to move up in the world or at least not be downwardly mobile. And I would witness these dynamics play out between parents and children and just laugh to myself thinking, I get it, but also this is how we were raised. It was hammered in really hard. Like, people are not well off in the world and it's your job to help them. I mean, the central uh, philosophy to my Jewish education was tikkun olam, this idea of repairing the world at our Reformed synagogue. And if you're told from day one that your job is to repair the world and then you go off and do something to try to repair the world, A, you probably won't repair the world completely and you'll feel like a failure in some way. And B, you're almost guaranteed to be downwardly mobile from your parents and where they were. I'm thinking a little bit about this generation gap between the parents and the kids and how my parents grew up in America and how I did and how we see it differently. When this was like, I don't know, the day before this most recent election, my dad sent the family thread a text that was like, Kamala's going to win and the sun will rise in the east and set in the west and it will be fine. And I promise. Like, he
Hmm.
was so certain. And I had this feeling of deja vu from the last time or two elections ago when we were like, well, there's no way Trump's going to win. So we might as well start celebrating having our first female president now, and we can, and I think part of that comes from his understandable understanding that growing up in the times he did, America really is this kind of amazing place. It's like the stock market's working, the housing market's working, social progress, civil rights, LGBT rights, feminism. I mean, I look at my parents' lifetimes and it's like, what an amazing time to be in America. And
Sure.
then I look at my like lived time in America and I'm like, we've got 9/11, the 2008 recession,
Yeah.
Trump again. And so naturally, I'm just less sanguine about the direction of the country. So when my dad says something like, "Don't worry, Kamala's got it. It's all wrapped up," I see a kind of hope, in what America is and can be.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, I kind of wish I had that, but I can't summon it in myself.
It's yeah, it's I mean, and this is kind of relating to my next question, right? The sort of the way that the hope um kind of teeters into guilt, kind of teeters into cynicism. Like this individual commitment to the good. I think that like you and I grew up pretty similarly, and as children of these like boomer liberals who are doing these kinds of reassurances, right? Like
Mhm.
Democrats are working. They are a great party.
Right.
And the political system in this country works. Electoral politics, great. Um, I think that, to me that sounds like more it's not even an empty reassurance, right? It's like your dad's doing his fatherly duty. He's
And
like, I
it's
take care of the family in the
and
text.
it's borne out by their, I don't blame them for like,
Totally.
like that's
Not at
is their
all.
what they've seen if with their own
Right.
two eyes.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. And so, but then my question to you, right? Like, um, well, let me give a little context for this. We see in the generations of the Greenspans, right? We see how like Scott and Deb try to fulfill their individual commitment to the good. And then we sort of see how that affects Maya and Gideon, and then how Maya and Gideon themselves kind of attempt to do it as well. I'm so curious, like as we're talking about guilt that comes from the impossible task. Because tikkun olam is, I think, a wonderful. It's not even an imperative, right? It's prayerful, right? It's a sort of a
Right.
like it's an intention. But when tikkun olam becomes like something you could fail at, like oh you fucked it up,
Right.
you actually
Right.
didn't you didn't heal the world. Um, and then we're kind of moving into a framework that I think that many folks feel is more dystopian, reasonably, right? I I'm really curious about how that sense of the good mutates, right? Like how does it
Mm.
mutate from generation to generation? How do these kind of wild events like what 9/11, the '08 crash, two non-consecutive Trump terms, like how does that affect our understanding of that sense of moral responsibility?
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, this is something I'm sure you relate to too, but I feel like I wake up every day on that precipice between total cynicism and and a sort of desperate grasping for reasons to be hopeful.
Mm,
Um, a reason, please, I don't want to live. I can't. It's untenable to live in a state of pure cynicism, or at the very least, it leads to
yes.
some dark places. But I also don't want to have false hope. I don't want to be soothing myself like someone's going to come along and fix climate change. Like some superhero figure is going to invent a technology that'll just solve it. Like that seems like on the other end of cynicism of like, well, you're just dreaming now.
Mhm.
And again, whether I'm cynical or optimistic on a given day, do my actions even matter one way or the other? So I wrestle with that all the time, and I think that my parents' generation has a stronger sense of being able to affect change on an individual level. My mom will write postcards to send to people in swing states, which is one of these things where I'm like, that's really admirable, and I'm glad someone's doing it. But I can't imagine a world where that makes any difference to person. Like I'm torn, right? I'm like, I'm
Yeah.
doing nothing, so I have nothing. I don't have any leg to stand on. But I also don't think writing these postcards is going to do anything. But she really feels like it's sort of my duty to do this, and maybe it'll tip the scale.
Mm.
So this question of like cynicism, optimism, inaction, action, I think it's really, I mean, I think what's changed, sorry to get back to your question, between these generations is also that money, there's just like so much more money concentrated now that, in the civil rights era, you could theoretically, you could march and block a bridge and get on the news and things would move maybe a little bit. Uh, but it feels like when you have so many people who are, capital B billionaires, and they also control the means of what news gets out and the dissemination and the social platforms, it just feels this like, how could you ever get someone up like that to listen or to hear you and do anything other than follow their own profit motive? So I just kind of feel like I feel like a much smaller figure up against a much bigger machine than I think maybe people of my parents' generation did. But I also think my one place where I'm like maybe I'm hopeful is that, and I'm not really, but is that like because the Democrats have been so trounced so badly, maybe there will be some opportunities to discuss some bigger, bolder, more progressive ideas that got shunted to the side in past elections out of a desire to play a safe, more moderate candidate. In a sort of messed up, like the worse things get, the broader the field of opportunity could be.
Mm.
Um, but so far, I have not seen too many people standing up and in the party at least and saying that. So yeah, I mean, reasons to be hopeful is like I'm still looking every morning desperately.
I might I totally hear what you're saying, and right, like I've experienced, uh, definitely like the feelings you're feeling to various shades and degrees, but I think that one thing that's coming up for me, right, as you're talking about the, Edmund Pettus Bridge, stuff like this sort of like I've been reading about like the evolutions of the left, right? Like, the basically like the new left and where the sort of where it kind of departed from the labor organizing left.
hmm
And like, we're bargaining with the AFL-CIO, or, here's Woody Guthrie, right? And but like I think that disjunct, right? It came, just like you said, it came with money, and it actually came during our parents' generation, this shift from the kind of like really more like legible collectivism to like the individual and the individual
hmm
identity, which of course, like, I mean, resulted in the civil rights movement, which, thank God that happened. I'm very pro civil rights movement, but I think too, we're seeing almost a kind of a like a gilded age unto decadence, unto decay of the left,
hmm
where like it's getting to the point where it seems maybe more morally expedient to like cancel this comedian
hmm
than it does to block the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And so, and there's, of course, I think the sense of smallness and defeat is, I mean, it's not that it isn't merited, right? It's not that these aren't real things that are happening, but I wonder too if like maybe the channels for hope could change. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I'm
It's a
I
different
mean,
channel.
to your
Yeah.
point about the individualism, I think about it a lot because I think even us on the left or people on the left or even liberals, we all drunk that Kool-Aid so thoroughly. I mean, the sort of individualism is has been, at least since, Reagan, like so the defining feature of our public life that again, like you can be like a well-intentioned liberal and your belief in the meritocracy will inevitably have this big individualistic component to it. I almost feel like there's a whole other this collective paradigm is a whole other paradigm that we haven't been in for so long, and it's hard to even conceive
Totally.
of. But I will also say, and this is kind of my dirty little secret, which in some ways is what animates a lot of this book, is my own ambivalence in that direction.
Mm.
I am one of these people who gets really fired up reading about like leftist politics and more communal organizing and this idea of like the community over the individual. And in my like heart of hearts, I'm like, but I don't want to be part of I'm like, I want to be on my own, doing my
Yeah.
own thing. I don't want to sit at a communal table and share a house with 40
Oh,
people.
God.
Um, I
Yeah.
was just watching that movie Reds the other day,
Hmm.
and it's just so funny. Like the during the political speeches, I'm like, yes, like I'm for this. And then like the aesthetics of it and watching how they live, I'm like, I don't
No.
know.
Yeah.
A friend described it as like she said, she's like, I think you just have like like a cold little Joan Didion on your shoulder who's kind of like, but I kind of want to do my own thing and I don't want to I'm very allergic to like the group and the group speak I don't know, there's something funny about like where my politics and my tastes are and the collision of that is I think where a lot of this stuff springs from for me.
I honestly, I have to side with you. I have a very austere, and I think it's yeah, I have an angel Didion and I have a devil Didion, but they're both saying, don't live in the house where they bulk buy yellow lentils.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly,
I'm
exactly.
totally with you. So kind of, it's, I think too, this is an organic shift. We're talking, right, if we're talking about identity and we're talking about, trends in fiction, which we will certainly be getting into, but, um, and of course, the left, I think that it's worthwhile to bring up the fact that like this book does discuss Jewish identity in just such a refreshing and incredible, and I find it quite poetic, the way you discuss Jewish identity. I find one great example I think would be the way that Deb's resettlement committee, her experience working with the resettlement committee, helping these Syrian refugees kind of is almost this it's not a perfect there's a sort of like poetic parallelism, let's put it that way, with Gideon's subsequent journey. And where when here he ends up winding up like, at the end of the book. And so and of course this is a diasporic people, Jewish folks. So I want to pose to you a few questions about Judaism and fiction. And I think the first one, right, is like, I know we were joking about the stack of Philip Roth on your shelf, which you are like conveniently blocking right now, but there it is. There they all are. Um, but you know, I grew up, right, really kind of idolizing his writing, loving Woody Allen films. There are two guys who are in the dustbin for me in terms of individual behavior and harm and malfeasance, right? And of course, right, we've lost, other great scribes like Nora Ephron. We've lost a lot of these kind of boomer chroniclers, either to disgrace or to actual death, of like Jewish like cultural life and just like social life. And I think, as we're kind of talking about the like trends in the left, like I've noticed a trend for a whole lot of reasons, but I've just kind of noticed the left is sort of disaffiliating with Jews and Jews with the left, right? And that's a whole other story about like MAGA and Jews, but it's kind of resulted in this sort of dearth of like humane Jewish storytelling. At least I'm kind of looking, for more stories that are just talking about like Jewish civic life, the millennial experience. And this is where like hope really kind of rushes to sort of fill in that blank space. I'm so curious. You could talk maybe more about if you've perceived this dearth or like what you would like, and then or not, if you have other recommendations, and what you would like to see sort of fill that space.
Yeah, I've there's a Vivian Gornick essay where she talks about kind of the end of Jewish American literature.
Mm.
Um, and her thinking is basically it's the immigrant experience, which was so fundamental, the immigrant and assimilation experience, which was so fundamental to the first generation writers like uh, of course I'm blanking. He wrote The Rise of David Levinsky. I'm losing it. But just those immigrant writers, and then the second generation, the Roths, Bellows, that's all about immigration and assimilation. And Gornick says, well, once you're fully assimilated, as Jews are, she says at the time of this writing, there's not really anything left. And that's why, in her view, you see writers like Michael Chabon or Safran Foer or others turning either to Israel for a source of inspiration or the sort of Eastern European past
Mm.
and looking at a kind of quasi-magical folkloric past. But her argument is basically there's no Jewish American literature because there's no Jewish American life because it's just American life. And I've even seen some people, Chabon included, say things like, in some ways, maybe that's not a tragedy, but a triumph. Like American Jewish culture is so part of American culture that the sort of disappearance is actually it's because it's like we're all Jews now in a way. Like we all know what Jewish humor
Yeah.
is. So it's no longer a distinct thing. Of course, being someone that grew up, you know, born in the 90s and growing up when I did, the last thing you want to hear as an aspiring American Jewish writer is, "Oh, that's done." Um, and but it does beg a lot of interesting questions about what makes something Jewish and how do you write about contemporary Jewish life when contemporary Jewish life is very often hard to distinguish from contemporary American life in a mainstream way in general. Um, so for me, a lot of it comes down to like documenting that uncomfortable space of like
Mm.
being 95% assimilated, but then something will happen, there will be a bout of violence or something happens in Israel or whatever, and suddenly that 5% feels a lot bigger than you thought.
Yeah.
And at the same time, taking responsibility for, you know, like you were saying, like the whole contingent of far right Jews or Israel hawks or whatever,
Mhm.
trying to be like, where do they fit in the cosmology of like contemporary Jewish life?
Yeah.
So for me, the material in a way just presents itself because it's what surrounds me. My wife has this joke that we live down the street from the world headquarters of the Chabad Lubavitch, like
Wow.
their headquarters, and
Yeah.
if I jog there and back, it's about 3 miles and it's like a nice road and there's trees. So sometimes I do that as this little jog and she teases me. She's like, "This is your whole thing with Judaism. You run towards it and then you get there and you turn around and you run back."
Three
And I
times,
think,
no less.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that sense of confusion and ambivalence is itself very Jewish. I think
Yeah.
certainty and dogma is to me not very Jewish. So all of this kind of figuring it out is what makes the thing. Like
Yeah.
sending Gideon on birthright which happens in the book is, I think to myself sometimes, what would Roth do if Roth were alive today? And I'll think, well, surely he would, I was looking around going, how has no one written Birthright into a novel yet? Or
Yeah.
not in a serious way, if only because so many people do it and it's so central to the American Jewish experience and it's so insane. It just, for me, it's just looking around saying, what's a specific thing that has a universal, you know, uh, appeal or understanding, and why hasn't anyone talked about it yet? I will say though, to your point, I do think there was a period of time, Adam Kirsch writes about this in the 60s and 70s, especially where mainstream America regarded Jewish people with a sort of special sympathetic interest. It was sort of like the Holocaust and World War II have happened,
Mhm.
their assimilation is happening. Everybody's suddenly interested in Jews. I mean, Augie March is like is at the top of the bestseller list for like maybe a year, maybe more.
Mhm.
Like a long, difficult, super Jewish book is what mainstream America is like interested in reading. And I think we're just in this weird place now where, to your point about the left, like I think Jews who have left political leanings are straddling these worlds and being like, well, maybe I'm not pro-Israel, but maybe I'm a little uncomfortable with some of the ways that some anti-Zionists talk, or maybe like, it's like you're sort of regarded as more the like white oppressor than the like interesting minority for people to sort of gawk at. And
Mhm.
I just think that's worth documenting too. As a novelist, it's like,
Yes.
I'm not even taking sides here. I'm just like, well, that's the thing that's happening now. So how can I write about the power persecution dialectic that seems to me sort of emblematic of Jewish life today. But to finally answer your actual question, I don't know tons of writers in the literary space working on this, but weirdly, there's been a lot of independent film
Mm,
that is tackling this. And I noticed this only recently because it's only been the last couple of years, but you've got the Safdie brothers doing Uncut Gems.
yeah.
This year you had Between the Temples by Nathan Silver, A Real Pain, the Jesse Eisenberg movie. There's a movie no one seemed to see that I really liked called Armageddon Time by James Gray, Shiva Baby, Zone of Interest. There's like a whole range of movies where for whatever reason, that's the medium, but they're telling these Jewish stories in a complicated, humane way. And it saddens me, I guess, that there's not more books in that space, but I think it's being done, but maybe it's moved a little bit over to independent cinema.
That's yeah. I Shiva Baby and Uncut Gems especially phenomenal. But that's yeah, and I think it's a great point. I think it's, oh, there's just so much there, right? I'm thinking of I was recently gave my wife the book Cynthia Ozick's The Shawl.
Mm,
And as she was like, we were kind of talking about it, and I was thinking too of this. It's a Philip K. Dick novel. I can't remember the title, but and the whatever, like basically there's just been this kind of big immigration to another planet, and it's the Jews, it's the Israelites, right,
mm.
who are kind of regarded with this sort of like special care. Like they need to sort of like they need to rebuild their civilization, right? And there's like this industry that is exhibited, witnessed through the POV characters' eyes. And they have compassion for his son too, who has mental health issues. And so I was thinking like it's it's um it's such a it's such a fraught kind of like to me it's kind of like a fraught cultural moment, right? Because we do have the like oppressor oppressed dialectic coming from this, so, like kind of like new leftist. I think it's kind of like there's a little bit of a discursive rot happening there. It doesn't feel very interesting to me to talk about like who's the perfect victim and who's the perfect oppressor. But in assimilating, right? Like Jews having in assimilating to whiteness, Jews have now assimilated into the oppressor role. And of this dialectic that is not useful at all, And so that's what I'm sort of sensing is this kind of drift. And yeah, I mean, too, right? Like as I'm to this day, I have this like really difficult reaction when I read Goodbye Columbus or The Chosen People or that like that last like I think it's that last paragraph of Portnoy's complaint where he's freaking out because he tore the tag off the mattress. I was like, I mean, that's like paradigmatic of, of kind of what we're talking about, individual responsibility and
Right.
the meritocracy, the Jewish experience. And yet you know, um, I find Philip Roth so difficult to read. And even beyond the cancellation stuff, like, like even beyond like he did bad stuff, right? It's still like the misogyny with Roth, with Bellow, of course, with Woody Allen films. It's like it's right there. Pedophilia is happening in Manhattan. And it's impossible to get past, right? It's impossible to I think there too, right? There's an unpacking that needs to happen of not just like this sort of useless oppressor oppressed dialectic, but how that assimilation has taken place, and how and what kind of what has like what not just what sacrifices have been made, but also like how assimilating has looked like making a series of kind of ethical bargains or
Mm.
you know Madoff situations, Jews cheating other Jews. You know,
Yeah, there's something to be said for if there always has to one cost of assimilation you could argue is that it has to come at another group's expense in that
yep,
focus is going to shift off you to someone else.
yep,
And I think, Gornick has written persuasively that some of that was sort of displaced onto women, where it was like for the Jewish male to assimilate,
Right.
there has to now be a different, like a different target for the anger and but I also, yeah, I mean, I haven't, it's interesting with Woody Allen, for example, like whose work was so important to me.
Okay.
It's, there's time, like if it's one where he's not in the movie, it's like easier, or,
Yeah. Good
I think
point.
we're all sort of finding our own ways. For me, it's like, it saddens me, but it's also like not a reason to chuck the shelf as much as to say like, okay, if I'm going to re-engage with this, you sort of just do it with this added critical layer. And I don't think there's anything wrong with, reading a book and being like, this page makes me cringe, these pages still make me laugh. I, but what it stops is that full immersion where you almost get to, turn off a little bit. But maybe
Yeah.
again, maybe that's for the best. Maybe there's a way in which we should be a little more, turned on and tuned in to the stuff as we're reading. But um, to your point about like also that oppressed dialectic, like I joke with my mom that I'm not one for jewelry and I'm not one for like trumpeting identity, but were I the kind of person who wanted to, for instance, wear a Star of David necklace,
Mhm.
uh, I would have two good reasons not to.
Mhm.
One is I don't want some anti-Semitic crazy person on the street to say something, but two, I don't want progressives around me in Brooklyn to think that I'm super aligned with Israel as
Right.
well. And I think that
Wow. Yeah.
speaks to the whole thing right there, where it's like, it's not the kind of thing I would probably do anyway, but were I to decide I'd like to express this aspect of myself today, it's like, I don't want to be mistaken. It's too
Ah.
much explanation, and I think that's in a nutshell kind of the weird place we find ourselves.
Oof. Write this essay, dude. Okay, I'll share it widely.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking now about Maya. And just kind of because as we're talking right about like the which I think Vivian Gornick's point is really an accurate one here, right? Like who has to be thrown under the bus in order for the member of the marginalized group to rise. And I'm thinking about Maya Greenspan and her background in publishing, right? And but how she's going to what's going to happen without giving away too much because I don't care about spoilers a lot, but I know that most like 98% of people really do. So I'm not going to spoil anything, but I think it's okay to say that, Maya is she's inappropriately groomed at a point in her life when she was young and impressionable. And she is going to write a book about it. And when I read that, I was like, can this book exist? Like, can I please read Maya Greenspan's novel? Jesus. And because I think that, right, like, the way you're portraying her as this young, like millennial Jewish woman who had this ex really difficult experience, and also has an affinity, right, for the literary old guard, right? Which includes, of course, Roth, which includes Jerzy Kaczynski, right? Which includes all these guys who were, um, if not like outright faking a lot of stuff, Kaczynski, then we're doing the same similar kind of like sexually questionable and harmful stuff that befell Maya. And I'm like, I just want this book to exist, right? Because I feel like it would really kind of it would sort of speak to this experience that you're talking about, with the difficulty of wearing the Star of David and also through the difficulty of like just like existing in Jewishness in contemporary America. So I think maybe I want you to almost like like postulate about like what would be the book you'd like to see? Like what would you like the Maya Greenspan's what would you like Maya Greenspan to write? Like what would a book such a book look like to you or books?
That's interesting. Yeah, I sort of like you say, she's very and like me, she's very enamored of the old literary guard and also has had this lived experience that complicates that. And I think there's a line in the book where she's sort of like, uh, I don't really like, she's like, I'm not blaming these guys. Like, I would have loved to be a man in the 70s too. Like, that sounds
Yeah,
great, you know?
seems fun.
Um,
Yeah.
and I sort of, so when it comes to the book she writes, I think this is fairly spoiler free territory, but one of the things that happens in her section, as you know, is it gets in touch again or bumps into the man that sort of her teacher who had this kind of groomy relationship with her in the past.
Mm,
And he finds out that she works in publishing and he's got a manuscript he wants her to publish.
mm,
And the manuscript may or may not be about their relationship.
mm,
Um, and she reads it with this kind of feeling of like, this is the kind of old-fashioned thing that if it was done better, because he's not a great writer,
mm.
I think I could really like. But it's also weird because it's about me. And now I'm being asked to take it to the publishing meeting where I have no power because I'm a lowly editorial assistant and kind of offer it up to my bosses to be like, is this something we can publish? And then do I even want to be responsible for publishing a book that's maybe about me by this guy that maybe did me wrong and have him back in my life again? Like, there's all these weird questions circling around. And where she kind of comes to at the end of the book is whereas her former teacher has written a sort of first person, you might say auto-fictional account of what happened with them. She has her realization that she kind of wants to go bigger. She wants to write about what happened to her, but she also wants to write about other things happening in her life. And there's more of like a looking at the totality of my life with that as one episode. And maybe it's going to be multi POV and maybe it's going to be a little more indebted to the Russians. And
Yeah.
that, of course, is a little bit of my way of, my little dig at trends in fiction at the time, writing a sort of unfashionably multi-POV novel at a time when autofiction is really ascendant and you're kind of supposed to brand yourself a certain way. And my desire is always to like hide behind fictional characters and make them do things so that myself is pretty far removed. But in addition to being a little bit of a dig, uh, I think it's her way of saying like I'm more than this story. The story is of what happened with my teacher is part of my life, but it's not the whole story. And I don't want to sell it as a trauma narrative. I want it to be
Yeah.
one piece of a
Oh,
broader puzzle. Um, I'll say too that I was writing this, Me Too is very much in the news at the time that I'm drafting.
mhm,
And in addition to that, novels are starting to come out and memoirs, of course, and tell-alls and all kinds of documents about sexual wrongdoing and power abuses. And by the time I was reaching the end of the book, the sort of Me Too novel was already a little bit calcified into a trope, which is to
mhm,
say, and many of the tropes, by the way, that are shared with this story in the book, often it's a teacher, an older male teacher, a younger female student, people looking back with the distance of years saying that thing that didn't seem wrong to me at the time now does. How do I put the pieces together of what I felt then and what I feel now or what I should have felt then, all these things. And I was very conscious of I don't want to just do another one of those.
mhm,
And also identity stuff is like I am a guy, no one's going to be rushing to like my version of the same story that you can also get from women who have gone through it. That's not really what my goal is as a novelist anyway. What mattered to me more than the, for lack of a better term, sort of like Me Too arc of these two characters
mhm,
was the debate over who owns the story of the Me Too arc. And there's a big pivotal scene at an editorial meeting where everybody in the room is discussing the novel that her teacher has written, and she's there. And in a way, they're discussing her life, but because it's a novel, they're all applying different glosses on it. Someone's like, well, I thought this was a story of rampant abuse. And she's sitting there going, well, that's not quite how I think about it. It's a little grayer than that to me. Or someone else is saying, well, I actually thought that the girl in the story should have had way more agency. I feel like she never stands up for herself. And then Maya's sitting there going, should I have stood up for myself more? Like I thought I was standing up for my. And so to me, it's less about the abuses of power and these things that we by now we well know the contours of, and more about who's telling the story, and what's the interpretive gloss that's put on it, which is why in the end she decides to write her own thing because she's like, well, at the very least, I want control over the story, and I also don't want to give that story so much power that it blocks out my very interesting and complicated life beyond it.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah, I feel I resonate so deeply. I think with a lot of aspects of what you just said. Foremost, writing fiction about characters other than myself, so I can just kind of
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
retreat, yeah, behind the the one-way mirror. But I think also like the this idea of authorship, right? And how like Maya is I mean, this is a really real thing that I feel like, I'm contending with a lot of folks are contending with, right? In publishing where it's like there is such a pressure to and I think and you mentioned in conversations we had in the past that you were there kind of watching it this sort of auto fiction trauma trend develop in actually in that kind of just post Obama era, right?
Right.
And the pressure kind of remains, right? I think there's it's softened around the like give me all your trauma, but I think there definitely is. Yeah, I was speaking to a friend recently who, she's bisexual. She'd written a book with a bisexual main character. Why would she disclose? She's married to a man. Why would she tell PRH, right? Hey, I'm bi, but they were like, well, should we have a sensitivity? Like, and she was just, and so she found that these conversations kind of subsided when bisexuality kind of came up later
Yeah.
on and I was, for like, I think she was kind of feeling weird about it, and I was kind of miffed for her. I was like, come on,
Mhm.
and I've had people, I'll make a statement, right, about whatever Jewishness or queerness or whatever. And I mean, I don't think people are scanning me for queerness. I think I'm pretty clocked. But like I would have folks be like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I just have to ask, like, are you? And I'm like, well, you don't know about last names, I guess. Yes,
Right,
I'm
right,
Jewish.
yeah.
And so I think that there's a demand both for trauma and authenticity and a
Mm,
kind of lived experience. And then with that comes, right, authorship. Like, okay, is this an authentic narrative, right? It like, have you lived it? Then you can author it, you know?
right.
And I think it's a reaction to this literary old guard we're talking about, right? Where it's a reaction to, of course, Pablo Neruda violently sexually assaulting a Dalit woman and then writing, I forget where it happened, but like he's assaulting a woman who was working at a hotel and then writing a poem about it, and it's just kind of like, well, of course you want to course correct for that pilfering of a voice and that pillaging essentially is what it is, right, of a story. But at the same time, what is this course correction, you know, spelling out, right? And I think that's
Yeah.
where you're doing some really awesome work.
Yeah, I think I like you said, yeah, I worked in book publishing for a couple years and yeah, like tail end of the Obama era into Trump and very much watched that course correction happen. And like you say, there's a lot to correct for. I mean,
Mm.
for example, there's like a long history of white writers writing characters of color in terrible ways,
Yeah,
just like in ways that also are just bad writing, like
totally.
hard to uncouple in some ways, the what's offensive about it aesthetically and politically because they're so linked. You're like, well, if you'd written a full human character, it wouldn't have been an issue,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But you wrote a two-dimensional character and now it's touching on these other things. So big thing to course correct for, but then the pendulum swung and it was like, and now the answer is stay completely in your lane so you don't risk ever doing that, which of course then doesn't, like your bisexual friend, there's this thing of like, well, how do you know what I am, first of all? And and do I have to come forward and state what I am in order to have the right to write about certain things?
Right.
And second of all,
Wild.
uh, there's still a lot of mediocre writing going on, whether you're staying in your own lane or not. I mean, I just being such a partisan of fiction, it was very distressing to me to see that we were trending in this direction of all fiction is basically nonfiction, and you can only really speak from your own mouth, otherwise, you're going to get in trouble. Um, s- so I don't really, you always want to like stay away from overblowing the sort of cancel cultureness threat, right? Like I don't think anyone like there were no police showing up to the doors of white novelists saying like, we're ransacking your house because of an insensitive portrayal of, a character of color or something.
Right.
But I just really strongly insist that freedom to write whatever is so fundamentally important to me that even if 90% of my characters are upper middle class Jews who are similar to me, I will like die on the hill of you should be able to write whatever you want. You just have to understand your own motivations for doing so. I think a lot of time when people get in trouble, it's I wanted to write about this person who was really unlike me because if I dig deep enough, I have a sort of exoticizing fascination with them.
Yeah.
Like, wow, that person's so different. I kind of want to, at best, know it and maybe at worst, colonize that experience because it's so different and interesting to me. But if
Yeah.
you're going in with the right intentions and you do the job right, I mean, that's the whole thing. I don't think writing a woman, when we talk about Roth and those guys of that generation, it's funny because I actually personally don't think it's that difficult to write across gender, for example. I think it's difficult when that gender category is blocking out the sun and that's all you can see. So I think when you're like, so I had people before because, half the characters in this book are female. I never even thought for a second someone would be like, where do you get off? Because I was like, wait, I now I can not only write about white Jewish people, it has to even be men within that. Like that wouldn't have occurred to me.
Yeah.
I love Madame Bovary. Like I don't want that book to, be wrong.
Right.
But then people would say, you actually did a pretty good job writing women as if it were this special challenge. And I've just found in the writing, it was only a challenge when I was like, now writing woman. Oh no, now I have to tackle what it means to be a woman and how women feel about this as if it's this monolithic thing. But if you're just like, well, I'm writing Deb Greenspan or Maya Greenspan, and
Thank you.
being a woman is one of 10 things that is important to their persona, it's like not that daunting. I can imagine the farther away you go from yourself, maybe it gets harder. But I just find it kind of in our rush to be authentic we sometimes make these identity categories out to be bigger than they are at the expense of the interior lives of people that are not actually that different from us. Um, there was a New Yorker profile of Mike White of the White Lotus recently, um, and the author was talking about, I always do this thing with characters of color where I ask, could they pass the pervert test, which is to say, could I imagine this character being a pervert? And if not, why? Like, and I think part of that pendulum swing was maybe white writers at times being then too safe and being like, well, I'm going to write in a character of color or a character of a queer identity that doesn't belong to me, and I'm going to make them a saint because if I make them a pervert, it'll sound stereotypical and bad. Well, now we're just flattening people into saints. It's just like my advice to like writers who are writing outside themselves is like just don't work like consider the identity, don't pretend it's nothing, but also don't let it be the guiding thing or you'll just run in circles. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, and then the last, like, you said it beautifully. I have nothing to add except this tiny little piece of,
Hmm.
which you already touched on. I just want to like make sure
Yeah,
I
yeah.
emphasize that it, if I'm a man, right, and I'm gonna write Deb Greenspan, and it seems this like monolithic task, and one of the first things that my mind goes to is like, well, what's the sex like? Like we're really talking about the 70s here. That is betraying to like a basically an exoticization or at best right it kind of like dehumanization of women. If a female character feels monolithic to you, dude, how do the women in your life feel? How do you
Right.
treat them, right? And so and same, of course, for the white writer, right? If this character of color feels like a representative of this racial category, how are you, and then this is not to be like this is not like moral reprobation. I'm just it's actually a testament to the fact that fiction is a new avenue for hope, right? And not to like harp on the whole empathy building thing, but I think it's true that if you have folks not only writing but invested in stories in exactly the way you're talking about, right? In the story not of a Jewish woman in a place and a time, but of Deb Greenspan. That's actually, I think, maybe a more like politically useful, poetically useful, and expedient way to think. But
And I'll say this quickly to
yes.
add to that, just that when I was writing, there's a stretch of the book where Deb, yeah, is like questioning her sexuality and exploring her
Mhm.
sexuality, and out of, an instinct to try to understand and not think that I'm so great I can just invent it out of thin air and know. I said, well, before I tackle this section, let me read some memoirs about the experience of coming out at midlife or of experimenting with sexuality in midlife, specifically for a woman of that generation.
Mhm.
And I read a memoir and I read another memoir, and you start reading more and more and realize none of these are the same. Like there's a couple commonalities, and that can be good for
Oh,
these like research purposes, right? Where you're like, well, it would be important to note this one thing that seems to be a bit consistent, and that maybe lends some credibility to the narrative. But once you realize every woman who came out at middle age came out differently and felt differently about it, it was like being granted the freedom to write it how you want to write it. It's like you can write the Deb Greenspan version because there's no definitive version. And in some ways, it's like the more research you do, the more people you meet and talk to, the more you realize you actually have way more freedom than you think. Like the more people the more you know there's not one way to do it. And so again, it's also just like getting out of your own head and your own space, and you come away not being, shackled by the experience of the other, but like granted this amazing ticket into like individuality. And I don't know.
it's God, I could talk about this with you for hours, but yeah, I think that's just so deeply well put, and I think that if there's a watchword or watchwords here, right, it's like
Mm,
span the categories until they no longer exist.
mm.
But yeah, anyway, I kind of I want to get into Gideon's birthright trip.
Okay.
It's such a it's so like I mean, we haven't talked enough about how funny your book is, and that is the that's the way to my heart, right? A good matzo ball soup, but also humor, and
Right.
and often both at once. And I think that like you demonstrate this kind of this like big like heady like moral political struggle that that like Israel has invested itself in and conservative Jews and so on and so forth. And it kind of it's kind of you satirize it in a way that makes it feel like again I know I'm probably overusing this word here, but it makes it feel like a human undertaking and a humane story. You have Gideon logging on to the Promise LAN Wi-Fi. You have these kind of like tweedy, bespectacled Israeli dudes with AK-47s, hanging out around like you've got these like Jewish guys are heavily armored up, and it's like, oh, is that, whatever, is that like Abe from Yeshiva, or is like this is a
Right.
with a it's funny, right? And I think that kind of almost defangs what has become such a polemical discursive headache in our country, and to my mind, a very ineffective proxy for
Mm,
demonstrations of the good or the correct politics on both sides,
yeah.
as I think exemplified by the Your Star of David story, the jewelry. So can you speak a little bit to like just like what is it like to include birthright in a novel? I imagine you had your own birthright experience. Tell me more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say it's this was obviously it's set and was also written well before both October 7th and then the subsequent like absolute bombing out of
Yeah.
Palestine. So, and I say that in part because not as an excuse, because I was actually asked at an event post October 7th, like, would you have done this differently?
Mhm.
And I said no, both because it's set in 2013, 2014, so you can't write that as if these future events have taken place. But also, I stand by it, to go back to this multi-POV thing, you have all these different characters representing different sides of the argument. And I'm my goal is not to tell you how to think, and I don't even know what I think. So, it's like I wouldn't have changed it, but I say it in part because, someone reviewed the book recently and was talking about, the problems of this book seem small in the wake of these, these attacks. And I sort of feel like, but these attacks, both on Jews and by Jews, particularly by Israel,
Mhm.
are always happening. There's peaks and valleys, but we always are living in between attacks. And just because one happened yesterday versus 2 years ago versus 5 years ago shouldn't really change how we think about these issues. So, with all that said, I did not go on Birthright myself. I went on a similar tour at a younger age with my family and some other families. My sister went on Birthright, and many of my friends did. And it was funny because I mean, some of the jokes or funny experiences in that section come from my sister's time. Some of it was too good, but like couldn't be included. But like I wish there was an outtakes reel or a blooper reel because I mean, she she had a her tour was led by a guy whose online handle is something like the CrossFit Rabbi, and he's this like, gym bro dude. And there was a girl on the trip whose last name was Ham, who had just converted and was like super conservative. Like there are just all these crazy things that I was like, I wish there's just not space.
Sure.
But it seems to me that like a birthright trip is a comic farce of an experience. You
Yes.
land in another country, you're shown a very particular version of Israel. With if you bring up stuff outside of that narrative, you get shut down. But the whole thing behind it is we're really hoping you meet someone on this trip and get married and eventually move here.
Yeah.
And they're not subtle about that. Like I included this detail in the book, but I read an account, funnily enough, I think this was a trip that Barry Weiss went on like a million years ago and blogged about for, Tablet or the Forward or one of these.
Oh, phenomenal.
This is like 2000, early 2000s or something.
Yeah.
It was like all these like young media people went on one, and they did the thing where they handed out M&Ms, and they were like, if you take a red M&M, you're not green M&M means you're single, yellow means you're like open to meeting someone, and red means you're like off limits. I have a partner, and you read about something like that, and you're like, they are not disguising at all that the point is to have sex and fall in love with an Israeli soldier and move to Israel. And they people like Sheldon Adelson are pouring billions of dollars into this endeavor. You're supposed to connect with your homeland and get this kind of propagandized version of Israel, but you're also supposed to fuck. I mean, that's not part of it. And I remember a good friend of mine came home from a birthright trip, um, and was like for 2 weeks talking about giving these like very pro-Israel talking points. And this is an otherwise very intelligent, critical thinking person. And
Mhm.
like after 2 weeks, it kind of faded into the background. And it was like he literally snapped out of a dream. And I was like, what was that, by the way, last week that you were saying? He was like, yeah, sorry, I don't know. I just like coming off the trip, it was really weird. Yeah, that was kind of crazy. But like he was under its spell. And so anyway, the fact that it's political, but it's kind of sexual, I was like, this is the genre that best suits the birthright trip is the sexual farce. Like
Yeah.
there's a plot point in the story where the character's hiding under a bed while the girl he
Yeah.
likes is hooking up with someone on top of the bed. I mean, it's classic like Italian comedy of, like people
Yeah.
hiding in the bedroom and popping out of doors. And, it's touchy, obviously, because you're like, this is a really tricky political thing, but it's also just ridiculous and insane. And so one
Yeah.
of the strategies was lean into the comedy, and one of the strategies was give voice to different sides of this. So like, and have Gideon, the main character, effectively be undecided slash ignorant. So
Uh,
one character is saying, spouting some pro-Israel stuff. Another character is trying to raise dissent and say, why aren't we talking to Palestinians on this tour? Or how come your map doesn't include the West Bank? Or why don't you call it Palestine or whatever? And these mouthpieces are going, and he's kind of in the middle going, I'm trying to get laid. So let me figure out what the girl that I like, where she lands.
yeah, teenage
And
boy. Yeah,
exactly. And
totally.
so I don't know. I think that's the reality of a lot of these trips is there's a lot of stuff about homeland and politics, and also everybody's like looking around, being like, who's hot, who's single.
Wow.
And I kind of just feel like that's so funny. Like, and I could not believe that it hadn't happened in fiction before, or if it had. I remember actually I talked to a journalist about this because the year Hope came out, there were one or two other books that included a birthright scene or reference.
Uh,
And but it hadn't been really done before. And the closest I saw was there was a Broad City episode where they go to Israel, and it started really promisingly in much the way I'm talking about, where the girls get on the plane and they're seated according to like this kind of matchmaking thing. Like the people who are heading the trip are like, we want you to sit with boy, girl, whatever.
oh.
And but then they never get there. The episode never, the plane literally never lands. And whether that was because that wasn't where they were taking the show, or they couldn't film there, or they decided to steer for whatever reason,
Mhm.
they never got there. And I was like, all I wanted was for this plane to land and then to see them go through it.
Yeah,
So part of me was just like, someone's got to do this. And if I don't do it, someone's going to beat me to it. And
sure.
it is the quintessential American Jewish thing. Um,
Yes.
and it's insane.
It's insane. Yeah, I mean, the sexual farce, well, bombs are falling on Gaza, right? And you're being, yeah, and you're having this like you're having it. I can only imagine being a hormone-addled teenage boy and having this weird kind of, yeah, this sort of like conservative Israeli exceptionalism, whatever, rhetoric being drilled into you, getting a Potemkin tour of
Yeah,
everything that's working. And
right.
then, yeah, I think what ultimately ends up happening with Gideon it's fantastic, right? Because it's, he is in this place of indecision, right? In this place of, I think you and I talked about, like, there is not a simple way to just kind of make a pronouncement about the situation. And the more you learn, the more complicated it gets. And so the kind of his route through, his route out, it's not the one he expected to take, but it's really a great one. And actually, my last question for you, and it kind of, as long as we're talking about diaspora, homeland journeys, all this jazz, um, I mean, I thought it was amazing that I thought it was both amazing and it had to happen that Gideon's studying epigenetic trauma.
Mm,
And I think that if we're kind of talking about, right, like what are the Jewish themes? What are like one of the millennial Jewish themes too
mm,
in contemporary fiction? It would be epigenetics, right? It would be, like maybe not a technical discussion of it, but the fact that my nickname for it is genetic, like a genetic stress fracture that almost
mm,
like gets inherited, over the course of generations. The fact that it's this disjunct, it's the way I've experienced it, it has been like, well, here I am, and I have my political and creative beliefs, and I'm assimilated in these ways. But I feel profoundly affected by this medical abuse, right? You walk in, put me in a doctor's office, and the doctor is starting to go, like there are like shades of experimentation are coming out, right? Or shades of sort of like high tech, a kind of like biodeterminism, eugenics are coming out. It's a hair-raising experience.
mhm.
And this is my personal experience, right? This hasn't been recommended to me, but like if someone like says like Wegovy to me, I'm like I can't even have that conversation. And that's my, I think, kind of I attribute that right to that aspect of my identity, I guess you could say. And I'm really interested in how like you see epigenetic trauma, like both like how you see it instantiated in the Greenspan family and how you see it as like a theme for like contemporary Jewish fiction.
This is like you save the hardest for last because I think I have such complicated feelings about those terms like epigenetic trauma, which yeah,
Hmm.
Gideon is in as part of this weird like study of if you like traumatize a chicken in a science lab,
Yeah.
will the eggs hatch and create like traumatized chicks,
Right.
which I think which I based, I believe, on a real study, and the answer is yeah. Um, so like there's science there, and there's something very and as you've been talking about, people's lived experiences bear this out. You're like, why do I get so freaked out about X, Y, and Z when I don't
Right.
have any personal experience with it? And whether that's epigenetic or you're getting raised on certain images or tropes, and then they appear in a different guise in your life and you like make the connection and freak a little. I don't totally know, but uh the reason I guess I'd say I'm a little suspicious is only because I've also heard it used um I think to justify a sense of a persecution that may be there, but not in the place people think. And to your point about that disjuncture, I think that sense of safety, relative affluence, say relative safety, relative affluence, relative assimilation, but also that being an insane historical blip and trying to know how to be and how to feel in a world where you are by no means in the top couple groups of people that are getting screwed over by this country, for instance,
Right.
but you know that something could go wrong tomorrow and we just get catapulted. Like this is not the norm. This is the aberration.
Sure.
Th- I think, I don't know. I mean, the I think you see this in our bad faith political discussions a lot when Jews of relative privilege, but who have been raised to feel that they are a super marginalized group get very defensive over very small things sometimes because they're
Mm,
like it's triggering this other stuff, and the
sure.
way that can sometimes turn into a violent or outsized reaction. Uh, all of this is just to say that something is at work, whether it's in the genes or some kind of cultural memory, or you'd have to do some kind of uh, raise a boy in the woods and not tell him he was Jewish or something, and kind of experiment to ever know.
Terrifying control group. I
Exactly,
guess you'll find
exactly,
out about epigenetic trauma there. Then, yeah.
exactly right. To know, but I there's obviously something like
Yeah.
certain traits and tropes, a kind of anxiety or skittishness or fear of joining the group or fear of, how come when I'm in a big stadium, I kind of freak out or like I don't want to sing the Pledge of Allegiance with everyone's hands on their heart. It like freaks me out in a way that doesn't
Yeah.
really make a logical kind of sense. Um, but certainly, I think I'm just interested in it on these two scales. One is the grand historical scale, and it can mean like reading about a really old thing from history and really connecting to it and relating to it and being like, wow, there is some deep connectivity here in how I think and how these people that were my ancestors thought. And on this very local level of like, what did my parents do to me? And what am I going to do to my kids? And
Right.
uh the book I'm working on now, there's a lot about it's a Jewish family that's very mixed up in the sense of there's adoptions, there's illegitimate kids, there's blended family, there's all kinds of situations that create a kind of impure Jewish family or in a very messy Jewish family. And so I've been spending a lot of time lately thinking about, and as I think about even having kids, and not being married to a Jewish partner, having all these, you just get into these. conversations about what do you pass on, what do you not pass on, and what do you pass on against your will? Like, what do you not want to pass on that gets passed on anyway?
Mhm.
Um, and so I just, yeah, I don't have like a good, clean answer, but just to say that that sense of transmission is very, it's very strong in me and it's very strong in the Jewish novel. I think you'll see a lot of critics talk about like the family is kind of the locus of the Jewish novel, and I think for good reason. But if anything, Gideon studying epigenetics is at least my way of gesturing towards um, the things that we get from parents, grandparents, and beyond that we don't always ask for and might not even be well suited to our current time, but that nonetheless are our inheritance anyway and need to be grappled with and adapted to. Um, Not denied or perverted into some kind of persecution complex that turns violent when really you have every good reason to feel, at least for the moment, safe, you know?
Sure. Oh, yeah, that's well, thank you for that. And I know I saved a difficult question for last, so I'll make that the penultimate question. Here's a softball. You mentioned the third book. Super excited. And can you just tease a little bit about you described it, but can you tease a little bit about maybe when readers could expect it?
Yeah, well, I'm working on some edits now. I'm hoping to turn it in a matter of weeks, which means
Hey,
readers need wait a mere 2 years
it's
or
two
what,
years, right?
you
2 years.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. You know
exactly.
how long it takes, but
Oh, I do. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, and it is also multi-gen, and I think you said it there was a it's like a but in Brooksea, like they have a family business, they have a family textiles.
yeah, Bud and Brooks, I know a mutual favorite of ours. It's it's a retail family that starts in
Retail.
dry goods, gets into the department store. It's a
Mhm.
kind of like pack peddler to private equity 100-year arc.
Woo. Oh my God. Oh, I'm really excited. Man. Well, now I should revisit that. I've always been more of a Magic Mountain gal, but like I'm pumped. That's gonna be great. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. And this is a great book. I'm gonna show it to everyone again before I bring it on down to the JCC. Thank you for coming on, and I hope everyone who's like listening, viewing, whatever, please get hope. Have some
Thank
hope
you.
and read hope. Thank you.
My pleasure.